Hi everyone. One more working memory video to get through today so that you have a little bit on the brain anatomy that's going on here. Yes, it's still me, lost my beard, different glasses, but here we are, interesting times that we live in. So following up on the behavior models that we talked about last time, I want to talk about just, again, a few key issues related to the neuroanatomy that we're talking about here. We're really focused in for working memory on prefrontal cortex and a little bit about some posterior areas that I'll talk about. But there's a lot of detail within the frontal cortex that we want to think about. So we often just especially in introductory level classes in psychology and neuroscience, to talk about frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex. It's all kind of one big thing, and higher level stuff goes on there. But it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously. So we can break up prefrontal cortex into different areas. And one of the ways we can do that is to break it up into orbital, medial, and lateral prefrontal cortex. We've talked a little bit about orbital before, but what we focus on for working memory is lateral prefrontal cortex, which we can further break up into dorsolateral and ventrolateral, right? So if you remember your orientation types of neuroanatomy back from intro neuro or even intro psych, right? Dorsal means kind of up and ventro means below, right? So dorsolateral would be the more superior part of prefrontal cortex, and ventrolateral would be the more lower or inferior part of lateral prefrontal cortex. And each of these plays an important role in our larger working memory system that we've been talking about, right? So we can look at dorsolateral PFC and ventrolateral PFC. So we're looking at the lateral part of the brain here. If we were looking at the medial portion, there would also be parts of medial prefrontal cortex that do different things as well. But again, in particular to working memory, we're thinking about lateral prefrontal cortex. And we can see memory-specific activity going on here. So this is an example of data from primates looking at specifically dorsolateral prefrontal cortex neurons that fire while memories are being maintained in your working memory. So we can refer to those neurons as delay neurons, right? So this is an example of a task that we might give a primate to do, where we have them looking at a screen and they're focusing on a crosshair in the middle of the screen. This is pretty typical for experiments in monkeys and humans that use visual information. So looking at this crosshair, and then they'll get a cue, right? Again, they're looking straight ahead, but they'll get some cue in the periphery that tells them where they're going to need to make an eye movement. And there's some sort of delay. And so during that time, they're needing to remember where that cue was. And then when the crosshair goes away, they'll have to make a movement and look toward the part of the screen where that cue told them that they're going to need to look. And there's different neurons that are active at these different times, right? So we have some activation involved in recognizing the cue, right? Some activation involved in making that response, but you'll see that there's neurons that are really interested in what's happening during that time where the information is gone, right? Whatever that delay is, there's neurons involved in maintaining the information related to that piece of information. And what we know is that if delay neurons don't maintain that activation during the delay, that's usually when errors occur. That loss of neural activity seems to represent the loss of that information. So on trials where we don't see a lot of increased activity during the delay, that's when we tend to see animals make mistakes, right? And different neurons seem to encode different pieces of information. So this is an example of kind of spatial information, right? And if we're recording from one set of neurons, there's actually an example here, right? Delay neurons that are only interested in maintaining information when the cue is at the bottom center of the screen, but there's different neurons that would be involved in recognizing these different spatial locations, right? We have many, many different neurons, so you could imagine lots of different types of neurons involved in maintaining lots of different types of information, right? So we have a lot of specificity going on here. We can map out the anatomy in a little more detail. So this is what we think about in relation to Baddeley's model in particular that we talked about for behavior, right? Where we have our central executive, we have our phonological loop, and we have our visual spatial sketchpad. And these are primarily located in different parts of prefrontal cortex. So we can think about the central executive, right, responsible for manipulating information in our working memory. That seems to be bilateral dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right? So both left and right hemispheres, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is responsible for that central executive aspect of our working memory. Then we separate into different roles of the different hemispheres based on the type of information. The phonological loop, that kind of verbal buffer for our working memory capacity, right, maintaining information, right, seems to be left, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex seems to be the main component of our phonological loop. And there's even more. You can break it down into the anterior part of left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex being more semantic information, whereas the posterior part of ventrolateral prefrontal cortex might be more phonological information, right? And then in the right hemisphere, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is where our visual spatial sketchpad, so that visual and spatial component of our working memory, which again is separate from the phonological loop. They each have their own kind of capacity, right? So we can separate that out there. And then in terms of other brain structures that are involved in the rehearsal of information, right, actually kind of repeating and actively maintaining that information in your working memory, we bring in other brain structures as well. So for the phonological loop, we find that it's talking a lot with more posterior language areas of the parietal and temporal lobes, for example. If you took neuropsych of language, you know what I'm talking about, right? But in general, you can think of these just posterior language areas are involved in kind of rehearsing information. And for visual spatial information, it's similar, but just right hemisphere kind of visual areas in the temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes. Information involved with recognizing objects, spatial locations in our environment, right, that we would need to maintain information in our visual spatial sketchpad. So these kind of reciprocal arrows here are really just meaning that there's constant talking between these areas that are involved in the maintenance of that information. But you want to be able to talk about how there's different anatomy related to these different functions of working memory. Right? And there's a lot of information here. So we're pretty confident that left and right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex are involved in these different types of information, language in the left, visual spatial in the right. And there's a lot of information that's interesting here from patients as well. So if we look at different types of psychiatric patients who have damage to the left side of their prefrontal cortex, we often see trouble with auditory rehearsal, that phonological loop, but not trouble with their visual spatial sketchpad type of working memory, right? Whereas damage to the right side of frontal cortex gives us the opposite pattern. So another nice double dissociation there, where left damage does one thing, right damage does another thing. So this is really valuable. So what is the prefrontal cortex then really doing? There's some debate here, right? But this is another nice way of visualizing that talking that happens between our frontal cortex and posterior areas involved in what's going on here, right? So the traditional view is more storage, right? That the prefrontal cortex is helping us store memories in place in the moment, right? That it keeps it in our conscious awareness and it's just storing it there before it maybe gets sent to long-term memory, whether it's declarative or non-declarative information. But another view is that it's coordinating. It's maintaining activity in kind of posterior portions of cortex that represent those temporary memories, right? So it could be parietal or temporal areas, right? In addition to just kind of, right? So the maintenance is that storage, but also working with other areas. And that's a little more of a newer theory that people work with at this point. But it's really unclear, right, whether it's storage or coordination. But what I want you to take away from this is that it's not just frontal cortex working on its own, but that frontal cortex is coordinating, whether we're talking about dorsal areas for the central executive or ventral areas for our two different buffers, the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad, that they're talking and coordinating with parietal and temporal areas for that phonological or spatial information, or even if we're talking about the central executive, parietal areas involved in attention. So frontal cortex may be directing that complicated symphony that we're working with there, but it's not working alone, right? And so when we think about now memory, all these different systems we've talked about, right? We have incoming sensory information. Some of that is going to be picked up in our working memory, and we're going to try and maintain and use that information. And some of that will get sent to, long-term storage, whether it's declarative for that type of information or non-declarative, right, for the more skill-based learning that we talked about in the last chapter. But working memory isn't just about new incoming information. I've kind of hinted at this before, right? But it's also about pulling back up information that we've already learned to use in the moment, right? So just like other executive functions, that part depends on dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well. That is, prefrontal cortex will be involved in pulling up old information that we want to use. And we talked about this, right, back when we talked about declarative memory, but it seems to be involved in that kind of pulling up old information as well. So we see strong activation of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when we're trying to retrieve past memories that we have, and in particular when we're trying to remember the source of past memories, right? So we did talk about this before in the declarative memory chapter, but I wanted to bring that up again here as well. So prefrontal cortex is important for maintaining this information. But again, if you think about, I always like to use the example of taking an exam because it's very relevant to what we're all doing here together, right? But as you, right, read a question, you think about what information do I need? Prefrontal cortex is helping you pull that information back out of your declarative memory stores so that you can use it to answer the question in that moment, right? So prefrontal cortex is really important for both of those kinds of scenarios. So, right, just a little bit on the brain anatomy. It's not too complicated for this chapter, but within frontal cortex, it does break down into those different pieces. If you've looked at the practice exam, you know that I do want you to be paying attention to the details of that neuroanatomy a little bit. So let me know if you have any questions or if any of the other topics that were covered about the brain are unclear. Post those on the discussion board so we can talk about it a little bit. But otherwise, as always, stay safe and healthy, and I'll talk to you again soon.